There is a morning in December 1922 that you need to see first, before anything else, before the smoke and the silence and the 60 years of nothing. You need to see it, because if you do not see it, the rest of this story is only an atrocity, and atrocities are easy to hold at a distance. So stay here a moment, stay in this morning. The cedar smell comes first. It comes before dawn in Rosewood, Florida, rising off the flatwoods and the swamp hammock and the stacks of red cedar waiting at the old mill. A smell that has soaked into every plank and every porch post and every piece of furniture in every house in this town. A smell so deep and so constant that the people who live here have long since stopped noticing it, the way you stop noticing the smell of your own home. But a stranger passing through on the road from Cedar Key to Sumner would catch it the moment the flatwoods opened up, would breathe it in without meaning to, and for the rest of their life, that smell, warm, woody, faintly sweet, would call up a memory of a small town in the Florida scrub where the light was thin and gold in December, and the Spanish moss moved in long, slow curtains from the live oak branches. Haywood Dorsey is already awake. He is a broad-shouldered man, 34 years old, with hands that have been stained a particular amber brown from years of handling cedar timber, and he stands on the porch of his house on the east side of Rosewood in the December dark, drinking coffee from a tin cup, listening to the flatwoods wake up. The whippoorwills are finishing. The mockingbirds are starting. Somewhere down the road, old Gussie Mitchum's rooster is announcing itself with the particular lunatic urgency of a bird that has never once been right about the exact moment of sunrise. And Haywood smiles into his coffee without meaning to, because that rooster has been wrong every single morning for 3 years, and it has never once seemed discouraged. Inside the house, Zinnie is still asleep. She will sleep another 20 minutes. Haywood knows this the way you know the rhythms of someone you have lived beside for 7 years. And when she wakes, she will make a sound like a question before she opens her eyes, and then she will be fully awake and moving, because that is who Zinnie is. A woman who wakes fast and moves faster, who grades her students' papers at the kitchen table while she nurses their daughter Cora, who sings under her breath while she braids her hair in the mornings. Fragments of hymns and popular songs run together like a language only she speaks. She's 28 years old, and she's 5 months pregnant, and she carries the pregnancy the way she carries everything else, forward, without complaint, as if it is simply part of the work to be done. Their daughter Cora is 3. She is asleep in the back room under a quilt that Zinnie's mother made, and she will sleep until the rooster's 4th or 5th attempt at dawn, and then she will come padding out in her nightgown with both eyes still half shut, and she will climb onto Haywood's lap on the porch and lean her whole warm weight against him, and he will hold her there while the flatwoods finish waking up. And this is the best part of every morning, this small weight, this trust, this child who smells of sleep and cedar, and the particular sweetness of a child who is still very young. This is December 1922. In 4 weeks, none of this will exist. Every building in Rosewood will be ash. Every home, every church, every schoolhouse, every lodge and store and smokehouse, all of it burned down to the foundation, and some of it burned below the foundation, burned until there was nothing left to say a town had ever stood here. The survivors will be in the swamp, moving through black water in the Florida January dark, carrying children, moving away from the sound of fire. The dead will be in unmarked places, in the scrub, in the swamp, in graves that will never be recorded or remembered or found. And for 60 years after that, nobody will say a single word. Not the people who survived, not the people who watched, not the people who did it, not the county, not the state, not the nation. The town of Rosewood, Florida, will disappear from maps, from records, from memory, from the world. And the morning on this porch, the cedar smell, the bad rooster, the sleeping wife, the sleeping child, The mockingbird starting in the flatwoods. This morning will disappear with it. So, stay here, just a little longer. There is a whole town to know before it is gone. The town of Rosewood was not a large place. It would not have appeared on most maps, even before it was destroyed. It was the kind of settlement that existed at the scale of a community, rather than a municipality. A cluster of families who had built something real and specific, and theirs on a stretch of flatwoods in Levy County, Florida, about 3 miles east of the larger white town of Sumner, and about 50 miles southeast of Gainesville. The nearest town of any consequence was Cedar Key, down on the Gulf, where the cedar pencil industry had once made men rich, and where the memory of that richness still shaped everything, including Rosewood. Rosewood had been settled in the 1840s, and by the turn of the century it had grown into a genuinely functioning community with its own economy, its own institutions, its own character. The economy ran on cedar, Florida red cedar, the finest pencil wood in the world, and for decades the pencil mills had pulled it out of the scrub and shipped it north, and the men of Rosewood had worked the mill and owned land and built houses and accumulated the kind of modest, stubborn prosperity that does not announce itself, but simply exists, generation after generation, as a fact of life. The Kummer and Sons lumber operation in Sumner employed some black workers from Rosewood. The turpentine camps took others. But Rosewood itself had its own employer, its own social order, its own web of family and obligation and memory that ran 3 and 4 generations deep. By 1923, the cedar was thinning. Everyone knew it. The big pencil mills had moved on, chasing timber, and the Rosewood mill ran at a fraction of its old capacity. Haywood Dorsey felt this every week, but Rosewood was not a struggling place. This is important to say plainly, because it is a thing that gets lost in the telling of what happened to it. The narrative of destruction sometimes implies that what was destroyed was already fragile. Rosewood was not fragile. It was a stable, property-owning black community in a part of Florida where such things were not supposed to exist, and that stability, that ownership, that permanence was exactly the thing that made certain people in Levy County look at it with eyes that were not friendly. The town had an African Methodist Episcopal Church, the AME, a white clapboard building that stood back from the road on a slight rise, shaded by 2 enormous live oaks that must have been old when the town was young. And on Sunday mornings, the singing from that church carried across the flatwoods for half a mile in every direction, deep and full and serious, the sound of people who believed what they were singing. The congregation was led by its deacon board, since they were between regular pastors, and services ran long because nobody seemed to want them to end. The singing went on, and the testifying went on, and in summer the ladies fanned themselves with cardboard fans from the funeral home in Cedar Key, and in winter the wood stove in the back heated the room to something very close to comfort, and Haywood and Zinnie sat in the 4th pew from the front, and Cora sat between them and fell asleep against Zinnie's arm every single Sunday, without fail, regardless of how loud the singing got. The school was a 1-room building on the north side of town, painted white like the church, with a porch that ran the full width of the front, and 6 windows that Zinnie kept clean, because she believed, with the conviction of someone who had been taught that education was a sacred thing, that her students deserved to do their learning in a room with clean windows and enough light to see by. She had 11 students ranging in age from 6 to 14, and she taught them all simultaneously in the manner of someone who has learned to manage complexity without making the complexity visible. She taught reading and arithmetic and geography and a little history. The history she taught was careful, because she understood the stakes of being a black teacher in a black school in Florida in 1922. And the history she taught was also honest, because she understood the stakes of being a person who lied to children about what the world was. The Wright store sat at the intersection of the two roads that formed Rosewood Center, and it was the kind of general store that sold everything a small town needed, and a few things it didn't. Dry goods, salt pork, sugar and flour and cornmeal in big sacks, lamp oil, seed, rope, work gloves, a small selection of patent medicines that the proprietor, John Wright, recommended with a straight face and no great medical authority. John Wright was white, which was unusual in a predominantly black community, but Rosewood was not the kind of place that simplified easily into categories, and Wright had been part of the town long enough that people thought of him the way they thought of weather. A constant, neither wholly good nor wholly bad, subject to change. He extended credit when he could. He knew everybody's name and everybody's business. He had opinions about everything and stated them freely, which some people found obnoxious and others found comforting, and in a town of 120 people, there was nowhere to stand between the two opinions anyway. Gussie Mitchum lived in the house closest to the cedar swamp on the west side of town, a small weathered place that had been built by her late husband 40 years ago, and that showed its age in the way old houses show their age, which is to say honestly, with a slight lean to the front porch and a back window that had been stuck open since the summer of 1918, and had a piece of oilcloth nailed over it instead of glass. Gussie was 68 years old, and had lived her entire life within 5 miles of where she was born, and she wore this fact without apology, as if rootedness were itself a form of achievement, which perhaps it was. She had seen the cedar boom and seen it slow. She had buried a husband and raised 4 children, and watched 3 of them leave for Jacksonville and Tampa, where there was work and, they said, more room to be a person. Her youngest daughter had stayed, and the youngest daughter's children played in Gussie's yard, and Gussie grew collard greens and sweet potatoes along the south side of her house, and kept the rooster that was so reliably wrong about Dawn, and she sat on her porch in the evenings in a rocking chair that had a broken arm she had wrapped with a strip of leather, and she watched the road with the particular attention of someone who has lived long enough to know that the road is where everything comes from, good and bad. The Masonic Lodge met on the second Tuesday of every month in a building near the church, and the men who belonged to it, and most of the adult men in Rosewood did, put on their lodge regalia with a seriousness that Zinnie privately found a little amusing, and that Haywood took very seriously indeed, because the lodge was the place where men who worked with their hands and owned their land and raised their families talked, without the presence of white authority, about what they wanted, and what they feared, and what they planned to do about both. It was a place of order and tradition in a world that offered black men in Florida very little of either, and Haywood understood its value even when the ritual felt slightly absurd. The baseball diamond was a cleared field behind the church, and on Saturday afternoons in summer and fall, the Rosewood team played against teams from other black communities in Levy County, and these games drew crowds that overflowed the field and spilled into the surrounding flatwoods, and a man named James Carrier, Sylvester's older brother, threw a fastball that visiting batters still talked about when they got home, a pitch that came in low and fast and moved at the last moment in a direction nobody expected, and the story of James Carrier's fastball had traveled far enough that some people came to the game specifically to see it and went home satisfied. Sylvester Carrier was 24 years old, the youngest of the Carrier children still living at home with his mother Sarah, and he was a hunter by vocation. He knew the swamp and the flatwoods the way a man knows something he has spent years learning to read, which is to say he knew it the way other men knew faces, the way still other men knew scripture. He could track deer through a cedar hammock and return 2 days later, carrying what he had gone for. He was not a large man, but he was a precise one. Precise in his movements, precise in his speech, precise in his opinions about things, which he expressed without decoration or apology. He had a shotgun he kept clean, and a dog he kept fed, and a mother, Sarah, whose house he lived in and whose word he treated as law, because Sarah Carrier was the kind of woman whose word men treated as law, whether they lived in her house or not. Sarah Carrier was 55 years old, a washwoman who also worked as a cook for a white family in Sumner, and she was the center of gravity around which her family and much of her neighborhood arranged itself. She had the quality that very certain people have of being completely calm when everything around them is not calm, not cold, not indifferent, but steady in a way that steadies others, the way a plumb line is useful precisely because it does not move. She went to church. She tended her garden. She cooked her son's meals and washed other people's clothes and was present at the bedside when anyone in the neighborhood was sick. And she had lived 60 years in a state that had made clear, repeatedly, and in multiple registers, that her life was not considered worth very much. And she had responded to this information by living with enormous dignity and no visible bitterness, which is not the same as no bitterness at all, but which is a thing that requires tremendous daily work and which deserves to be recognized as such. Aaron Carrier was Sarah's nephew, a WWI veteran, 26 years old, who had come home from France in 1919 with a particular look in his eyes that men who had been in the war often came home with, and that people back home often found uncomfortable and therefore tried not to look at directly. He had driven an ambulance at the front. He had seen things in France that the Florida Flatwoods, for all their capacity for violence, had not prepared him for, and he had also seen, in France, something that Levy County, Florida would not let him unsee once he got home. He had seen himself treated, briefly and imperfectly, and under the specific pressure of war, as a man whose life had value. Coming home had been the harder crossing. He worked when he could, helped his aunt when she needed it, and spent his evenings at the juke joint where George Bradley played piano with the loose, wandering confidence of someone who learned the instrument by ear. The juke joint held maybe 30 people on a good night, workers from the mill, women who had come with their husbands, and women who had come alone, old men at cards, young men standing near the wall with the studied casualness of young men at juke joints. Aaron liked the piano. He liked the smell of corn liquor and cedar sawdust, and somebody's good cooking from the back. He liked being in a room full of people who knew him. He liked being home, was what it came to, even with the things he had seen in France and the things he had come home to. This is Rosewood, in December, 1922. A town with a rooster and a piano, and a church with good singing, and a school with clean windows, and a general store where a white man knew everyone's name, and a baseball team with a pitcher whose fastball had become a legend in Levy County. A town with a Masonic lodge, and a cedar smell, and a juke joint, and a woman who kept collard greens along the south side of her house. A town with a family named Carrier, who had been here a long time, and a family named Dorsey, whose hands smelled of cedar, and a pregnant woman who woke up fast and moved faster, and taught 11 children in a room she kept clean because she believed they deserved the light. A town that was, in every measurable way, exactly what the people who lived in it had worked for generations to make it. Theirs. This is what you are going to lose. The Wright store smelled of tobacco and lamp oil and the particular indoor smell of dry goods. The flour sacks and the cornmeal bins and the bolts of cloth that John Wright stocked in a small selection that ran to practical rather than beautiful. Though in the summer, Zinnie Dorsey would sometimes stand in front of those bolts and consider the calico with an expression that John Wright recognized as the expression of someone doing arithmetic in their head. He didn't press. He waited. Most of the time, she left without the calico and left with flour instead, and he understood this without needing it explained. Wright had been the store owner in Rosewood for 11 years, long enough that his presence had stopped being remarkable to anyone on either side of the color line, though it remained slightly uncomfortable on both sides. The white man in Sumner thought he had set himself too close to the colored community. He extended credit to black customers, remembered their names, didn't make them wait at the back of the line. This made certain men in Sumner regard him with the disapproval reserved for white people who failed to maintain the arrangements. Wright paid this no visible attention, though he was not naive about what it meant. The black families of Rosewood had a more nuanced relationship with him. He was useful, he was fair by the local standard, but he was white, and this meant his fairness could not be counted on the same way that the fairness of someone with equal stakes could be counted on. He was good enough. He was there. He was something. Down the road from the Wright store, at the house where Haywood and Zinnie Dorsey lived, December was proceeding with the measured patience of a Florida winter, which is to say it was cool rather than cold, with mornings that required a jacket and afternoons that didn't, and evenings that went down faster than you expected into a genuine chill. Zinnie had put the last of the sweet potato vines to bed and planted a row of collard greens along the fence that ran behind the house. She had learned the collards from Gussie Mitchum, who had been growing them in Rosewood soil her whole life, and had opinions about the correct depth and spacing that she delivered with the authority of a doctor discussing surgery. Zinnie had followed these instructions exactly, partly because Gussie was intimidating, and partly because the collards that resulted from following them were extraordinary. The pregnancy was going well, which meant it was going the way a pregnancy goes when a woman is young and strong and has carried one child successfully before, with the accumulated tiredness of it building slowly, the way water rises, and with the particular internal quality of waiting that Zinnie had decided to treat as patience, since it was going to happen either way. And patience was the word for it that felt most like agency. She had told her students she would be away from school in the spring for a time, and she had arranged with a woman named Ethel Freeman to teach in her absence, though the school board had not confirmed this appointment, and Zinnie had decided to deal with that problem in January. Haywood came home from the mill on the short days of December, smelling of cedar and sawdust, and he was the kind of man who came home from physical work in good spirits rather than bad, not because the work was easy, but because he was constitutionally oriented toward his home, toward Zinnie's voice from the kitchen, toward Cora running at his legs when he came through the door, toward the smell of something cooking and the lamp on the table, and the weight of being inside a house that was his. He had bought this house. His name was on the deed. The deed was in a metal box under the bed, along with the title to the half-acre behind the house and the document from the county that confirmed, in the impersonal language of bureaucracy, that this property belonged to Haywood Dorsey of Rosewood, Florida, and not to anyone else. He was proud of this box, not in a way he talked about, but in a way that shaped everything, the way he walked through a room, the way he sat in the fourth pew of the AME church, the way he spoke to Cora about what her life might hold. "You come from people who built things," he told her, or something like it, in the wordless way that parents tell children the most important things, through the example of how they move through their own lives. At the lodge meeting in December, the men had talked about the turpentine prices and the state of the mill, and the question of the new county road that the county had been promising to improve for 3 years and had not improved. And they had talked about a man in Jacksonville who had organized a business association for black workers, and whether there was anything like that coming to Levy County. And Haywood had listened more than he spoke, which was his custom. He believed, with the evidence of his life to support him, that the world could be managed through patience and work and the careful maintenance of what you had built. He was not naive about what threatened him. He was from Florida. He knew exactly what threatened him. But Rosewood was a real place with real people who had been here for generations, and he had chosen to believe, was choosing every day to believe, that this place would hold. This is the last thing to know about Haywood Dorsey before everything changes. He was not blind. He was choosing. Gussie Mitchum had lived in Rosewood since 1862. She had been born here, 8 years old when the war ended, and she had watched everything that had happened in Levy County in the 60 years since, with the attention of someone who understands, that history is not something that happens elsewhere. She remembered the cedar boom, when the mills ran around the clock and the men came home with money in their pockets and there was enough, genuinely enough, and the town had the feel of a place building toward something. She remembered the slow contraction afterward, the mills cutting back, the younger people leaving for the cities, the feel of a place that was no longer expanding, but had not yet started to collapse. She had watched the Carrier family grow up and the Dorsey family plant their roots and the Wright store open and close its doors for a decade, and she had attended more funerals than she could accurately count, which was the nature of having lived as long as she had lived in one place. Her daughter, Luella, lived 3 houses away and came by every morning to check on Gussie, and every evening to make sure she had eaten. And Gussie submitted to this with the resigned grace of someone who knows it is offered in love, but would have preferred to be considered adequately self-sufficient. She was self-sufficient. The rocker on the porch creaked in a specific way she had grown fond of, and she sat in it every evening until the stars came out over the flatwoods. She had a feeling she had been trying to name for a few months, a feeling that was not quite dread and not quite premonition, but was something in the neighborhood of both, a quality of attention to the road that was slightly different from her habitual attention, a listening that was slightly harder than usual. She could not have said what she was listening for. She would not have said she was afraid. She had been in Florida her whole life, and she had learned how fear worked in Florida, the specific frequency it ran on, and she recognized the feeling she had been having as something adjacent to fear, but not quite fear itself, more like the air pressure change that comes before rain, the body knowing something the mind has not yet named. She sat on her porch in the December evenings and rocked and watched the road and listened to the flatwoods settling into darkness, and the rooster slept in its incompetent way behind the house, and the smell of cedar rose off the swamp, and Rosewood made its small ordinary sounds around her, and Gussie Mitchum thought, "We have made something here. Whatever comes, we have made something here." She was right about both things. In the last week of December 1922, a man held a New Year's party at a house on the south end of Rosewood, and George Bradley played piano until midnight and beyond, his left hand walking the bass and his right hand doing whatever it wanted, which was always something you hadn't anticipated, and Aaron Carrier stood near the wall with a glass of corn liquor and listened and thought about France, then stopped thinking about France and just listened to the piano instead, which was the better choice. Zinnie Dorsey danced with her husband for the first time in months, her pregnancy making the dancing different, but not impossible. And Cora, who was supposed to be asleep at Gussie's house next door, was carried over by Gussie herself at 11:30, because the child had simply refused to sleep through the sound of the piano, and Gussie said, with the tone of someone who has done everything she intends to do about a situation, "She won't sleep. She wants the music." And Haywood took Cora and held her on his shoulder, and she put her small hand on the side of his face, and he danced with both of them, his wife and his daughter, in the warm yellow light of someone's back room in Rosewood, Florida, at the end of December 1922. 3 days later, 1923 began. 5 days after that, the world changed. And in 60 years, nobody in that room, nobody who heard that piano, nobody who smelled that cedar in the dark, would say a single word about what happened next, to anyone outside their own silent circle of survivors. But that is still days away. For now, the piano, the yellow light, the cedar smell, the child asleep on her father's shoulder, the mockingbirds quiet in the flatwoods, waiting for their own morning. Stay here a moment longer. This is Rosewood. January 1st, 1923. New Year's Day in Sumner, Florida, was a day for resting and for church, and for the particular sluggish good humor of men who drank too much the night before, and were paying for it in the specific currency of January daylight. The Cummer and Sons lumber mill was closed. The white workers of Sumner were, for the most part, at home, eating, sleeping, sitting on porches with the wary patience of the slightly hungover. James Taylor was a foreman at the mill. He was 30 years old, a compact, serious man who ran his work crew with the efficiency of someone who equates authority with competence, and who spent his days managing the constant friction between timber quotas and human limitation. He lived in a company house, a good house by the standard of what Cummer and Sons provided, with his wife Fanny and their children, and he had gone to a neighbor's celebration on New Year's Eve and come home late and drunk and slept hard. And this morning he was at his kitchen table with his head in his hands when his wife screamed from the back of the house. He was at the back door in seconds. Fanny Taylor was 22 years old. She was, by most accounts, a pretty woman. Small, with dark hair she wore pinned up during the day and down in the evenings. And she had been living in the company house in Sumner for 3 years, which was 2 years longer than she had expected when she married James Taylor, and understood what a foreman's wife's life looked like in a Levy County mill town. What that life looked like was small, predictable, bounded on all sides by what was available to a woman of her class in a place of its size, and Fanny Taylor had found the size insufficient from almost the beginning. She was standing in the back room when James reached her, and she was crying, and there was a bruise forming on the side of her face, and she was holding her left arm with her right hand. She said a black man had broken in, had attacked her, had beaten her, had fled out the back when he heard James moving. James Taylor looked at his wife. He looked at the back door, which was indeed standing open. He looked at Fanny's face, at the bruise that was rising across her cheekbone with the uniform darkening of a blow recently landed. He believed her. He had no reason not to believe her. He chose not to ask the questions that would have required him to look more closely at the things he was not looking at. And he went to get his neighbors. What had actually happened in that back room is not fully knowable. It was not knowable in 1923, and it is not knowable now, because the only person who knew the complete truth was Fanny Taylor, and Fanny Taylor did not tell it. What is known, and was known to people in Sumner who paid attention, a white man had been seen leaving the Taylor house that morning, before the screaming started. The injuries on Fanny Taylor's face were consistent with a blow from a person approximately her own height. She had been, in the months prior, spending time with a white man whose name circulated in the gossip of the town, and then stopped circulating, because the gossip of Sumner was the kind that knows when to quiet itself. What is one lie worth? Move on. The story spread through Sumner the way a fire spreads through dry timber, with the speed and indifference of something that has found ideal conditions. A black man, a white woman, New Year's Day. The Cummer Mill was closed, which meant the men who worked there were home and available, and by afternoon there were 40 of them gathered at the mill yard, standing in the January cold with the focused energy of men who have been given permission to act on something they had been waiting, without knowing it, to act on. The name Jesse Hunter entered the picture within the first hour. Jesse Hunter was a black man who had recently escaped from a convict labor camp in the area. This was verifiable fact, and it became the hook on which everything else was hung. He had escaped. He was somewhere in the Flatwoods. He was, it was declared without evidence, the man who had attacked Fanny Taylor. The manhunt organized itself with the natural authority of a thing that already knows what it wants. Knox Hadley was 27 years old, a sawmill worker from Sumner, the kind of young man who is defined primarily by his proximity to other men's decisions. He went where his friends went, did what the group did, and understood his participation in collective action as a form of belonging rather than a form of choice. He had drunk considerably the night before, and he was still not entirely clear-headed, and there was a quality to the afternoon, the urgency, the men's voices, the weight of James Taylor's face when he talked about what had been done to his wife, that bypassed the part of Knox Hadley that would have needed to think carefully about what he was agreeing to do, and went straight to the part that was already moving. He put on his coat. He picked up his rifle. He went to the mill yard. They were looking for Jesse Hunter. They would not find Jesse Hunter in Rosewood. He was not there, had likely never been there, was somewhere else in the scrub, doing whatever a man does when he has recently escaped from a labor camp and understands exactly what will happen if he is caught. But this fact was not discoverable from the mill yard in Sumner, and the men at the mill yard were not in a condition to be careful about the difference between what they knew and what they believed. They went to Rosewood. Aaron Carrier was not hiding. He was at his Aunt Sarah's house, having spent New Year's Day quietly, and when the mob came to his door that evening, armed, loud, certain, he opened it because he had been in France, and he had come home, and he had decided, with the conscious deliberateness of someone who has thought about the available options, to live as if he were entitled to live, which meant not hiding in his own home when men came to his door. What happened to Aaron Carrier in the next hours is documented in the accounts of survivors and in the limited records that survived the subsequent erasure. They beat him. They tied him behind an automobile and dragged him down the road. They were looking, they said, for information about Jesse Hunter's whereabouts. Aaron Carrier did not have information about Jesse Hunter's whereabouts because Jesse Hunter was not in Rosewood. He told them this. They did not believe him, or they believed him, and it did not matter, because what they were doing was not precisely about information. He survived. This is worth saying directly. Aaron Carrier survived that night, which was not a thing that could be assumed in advance. He was badly injured, and he was taken away by the mob and put in the county jail in Bronson, which was presented at the time as protection, and which may have been partly that, and which was also the transformation of a victim into a prisoner, which is a thing that counties did then and have done since when the category of victim is inconvenient. What happened to Aaron Carrier that night, the beating, the dragging, the January road, happened to a man who had been in France, who had driven ambulances through the aftermath of battles, who had come home to Florida, believing that what he had done and what he had seen entitled him to something, even here, even in Levy County. It is necessary to sit with this for a moment. Aaron Carrier had served his country, and his country had this waiting for him. No arrests were made on the night of January 1st. January 4th, Sam Carter was a woodsman. He was, by all accounts from survivor testimony, a large, capable man in his middle years, who knew the scrub and the swamps of Levy County the way Aaron Carrier knew them in a different register, practically professionally, as someone who had made his life in relation to that landscape and understood it as a working person understands their workplace, which is to say completely and without romance. He could track, he could navigate. He knew where the paths ran and where they didn't. The mob knew this about him. They came to him on January 4th, demanding that he lead them to Jesse Hunter, demanding that his knowledge of the scrub serve their certainty that Jesse Hunter must be somewhere in it. Sam Carter understood his situation. He led them into the flatwoods. He did not find Jesse Hunter because Jesse Hunter was not there. He led them through the scrub for as long as he could manage it, on a path that led nowhere in particular, and was therefore useless to the men who had forced him onto it, and when they understood they had been given the useless version of what they had demanded, their patience, which had never been large, ran out. What happened to Sam Carter on January 4th, 1923, on a road near Rosewood, Florida, is in the documentary record. Such as it is, he was killed. He was tortured before he was killed. His body was left where it could be seen. I am not going to add commentary to a lynching. The rope is enough. The tree is enough. The body is enough. By the night of January 4th, the mob had grown. Word traveled fast in the flatwoods, not through any formal communication, but through the informal, immediate, deeply efficient network of men who tell other men about a thing that is happening and invite them to come and be part of it. They came from neighboring counties. They came from towns whose names meant nothing special. They came because the invitation had been extended and accepted. And by the time they gathered in the road outside Rosewood on the night of January 4th, moving toward January 5th, their number had reached something between 100 and 200 men, armed, organized in the loose way that mobs organize, with a direction, if not exactly a plan. They moved toward the Carrier house. Sarah Carrier's house was not large, but it was solid, well built by the standard of what Rosewood people built, which was better than the standard the county gave them credit for. It was a wood-frame house, with a porch and a front room and a kitchen in the back, and on the night of January 4th, moving into January 5th, it held Sarah and Sylvester and a number of women and children from neighboring houses who had come there as the mob approached, and the neighborhood understood what was coming. Sylvester Carrier had a shotgun. He had used it to hunt, to feed his family, to manage the occupational requirements of a man whose knowledge of the swamp was his primary asset. He had cleaned it that morning, which was something he did regularly, with the same regularity that Zinnie Dorsey kept clean the windows of the schoolhouse, not in anticipation of anything specific, but because a tool maintained is a tool that works when you need it. He needed it now. What happened at the Carrier house is documented in multiple survivor accounts and in the investigation that the state of Florida commissioned 70 years later. The mob approached the house with guns. Sylvester Carrier, from inside the house, from the dark interior, waited until they were close enough, and then did not wait any more. Sarah Carrier fired. The accounts differ on some details. This is the nature of events that happened fast, in the dark, that everyone who witnessed them was simultaneously trying to survive. But multiple sources confirm that Sarah Carrier was armed, and that she fired at the approaching men. She was 55 years old, a washwoman and a cook, the woman who had come to bedsides and sung at church and raised her children in Levy County. And on this night she stood in her own house with a gun, and she fired at the men who had come to destroy everything around her. 2 of the attackers were killed. This was not supposed to happen. The architecture of racial violence in the American South in 1923 depended, with the precision of a system that has been refined over decades, on the certainty that resistance would not be offered, or that if offered, it would not be effective. Effective resistance broke something in the system. It enraged the people who depended on the system's reliability. Sarah Carrier was killed. Sylvester Carrier was killed. The women and children who had sheltered in the house escaped through the back in the chaos, into the dark, into the swamp. John Wright, the store owner who had lived in Rosewood for 11 years and knew what was happening and understood its scale, was already hiding some of them. Women and children from the neighborhood who had come to him because he was the white man in town, and therefore the only person who could offer a certain kind of protection, contingent and imperfect, and entirely dependent on the mob's willingness to respect it. Wright hid them. He did not tell the mob. This was not heroism in the sense of a grand gesture. It was a decision made in the moment by a man who knew the people he was hiding and knew what would happen to them if he opened his door, and who chose, with the specific courage of someone who understands the stakes, not to open it. The mob burned his store anyway, later, not because they knew what he had done, but because they were burning everything. January 5th. The burning. Haywood Dorsey had spent the night of January 4th awake, listening. The sounds from the road were wrong. They had been wrong since New Year's Day, but tonight the wrongness had a different register, louder and closer, and no longer deniable. He woke Zinnie at midnight, and he told her what he had heard and what he thought it meant, and Zinnie got up without asking questions she already knew the answers to. She put Cora's shoes on while the child still slept. She put the metal box with the deed in the inside pocket of her coat. She woke Cora carefully, holding the child's face in both hands and saying her name once, quietly. And Cora woke up and looked at her mother's face and did not cry, because the thing in her mother's face was not the thing that made children cry. It was the thing that made children very quiet and very still. Haywood said, "Go south, through the flatwoods, toward the swamp, away from the road." He would be right behind them. He had to find a few people first. He had to warn a few houses. Zinni looked at her husband in the way that people look at each other when they are saying something that has no good words for it. And then she picked up Cora, and she went. Move. Shots. Far, then closer. The sound of men moving in a group, the particular percussion of a large group of armed men moving with intent, a sound with a mass to it, a sound that moves ahead of itself like a pressure wave. Fire. The Hendersons' house first, the Goins family's house next. Then the porch light at the end of the road, then another, as structure after structure caught and burned in the January dark. The smoke rising black against the dark sky, and then backlit gold as the flames took hold, each burning house illuminating the next, like a sentence that keeps extending itself, clause after clause, each one saying the same thing. "We are going to burn all of it. We are going to burn all of it. There is nothing here that will be left standing." Haywood ran from house to house and knocked and told people to go, and some of them went, and some of them were already gone. He found Aaron Carrier's mother and got her moving. He went to Gussie Mitchum's house. Gussie was on her porch. "Come on," he said. "Gussie, we have to go." She was in her rocker. She was watching the fire at the end of the road. "Come on," he said again. She looked at him. She was 68 years old. She had been born in Levy County in 1854, and she had lived her entire life within 5 miles of where she sat, and her husband was in the ground here, and her mother's bones were in the ground here, and the garden was here, and the rocker was here, and everything she had ever owned and made and known was here, and the fire at the end of the road was getting closer. "I'm not leaving my house," she said. "Gussie." "You go," she said. "Get your family. I'm staying." He tried. He stood on her porch and tried, and she would not move, and the fire was getting closer, and there were other people he had to reach, and the sound of the mob was louder, and Haywood Dorsey made a decision on Gussie Mitchum's porch that he would carry for the rest of his life, which is the decision to leave. He ran. What happened to Gussie Mitchum after that is not in any record. Her name does not appear in the 1923 grand jury transcripts. It does not appear in the survivor accounts collected by researchers in the 1980s and 1990s. It does not appear in the compensation legislation of 1994. She is not among the 9 survivors who testified before the Florida legislature in 1993. This is the thing that the historical record does with certain people. It simply stops. She was here. Then she was not in any document. The narrator cannot tell you what happened to Gussie Mitchum because the narrator does not know, and the narrator does not know because the records do not say, and the records do not say because the records were never made, because the people who burned Rosewood did not keep records of what they burned, and the people who should have kept records declined to look. She was here. Her rocker creaked in a specific way. Her rooster was wrong about dawn every morning for 3 years. She grew collard greens along the south side of her house. She was here. The train. Not everyone could make it through the swamp. Not every person in Rosewood on the night of January 5th was young enough or strong enough or oriented enough in the dark and the smoke to move through flatwoods in the January night, with children on their backs, and the sound of fire behind them. Some people could not run. Some people had nowhere to go. Some people were simply caught between the fire and the mob and the dark. The train line ran through the area, and a freight train came through on January 5th. The account differs slightly in different sources about the exact sequence. And the train engineers, men named later in survivor testimony as John and William Bryce, slowed the train near Rosewood. Whether this was pure humanitarian decision or something more complicated is not entirely clear. What is clear is that women and children from Rosewood were put on that train. Some were put on it by men who stayed behind. Some climbed on themselves. Some were lifted up by hands reaching down from the car, anonymous hands in the dark, and the train moved, and the women and children on it were taken out of Levy County to Gainesville, to safety that was relative, but was safety compared to what they had left behind. John Wright had, by this point, sheltered somewhere between 12 and 20 black women and children in and around his store and property. The mob was burning structures systematically. They had moved through the neighborhood like a wind moving through it, touching every surface, and there was a quality to the burning that survivor accounts describe as purposeful rather than chaotic, as if the men doing it had a list, as if they had agreed in advance that the work was to be thorough. The church burned. The school, Zinnie Dorsey's school, with its clean windows, the one she had told her students she would return to in the spring, burned. The Masonic Lodge burned. The general store, the Carrier House, the Dorsey House, the house where the New Year's party had been held 5 days ago, where George Bradley had played piano until after midnight, and Aaron Carrier had stood near the wall listening, and Cora, Dorsey, had put her small hand on her father's face. Burned. Every structure in Rosewood, Florida. Every one. The baseball diamond was not a structure. It was a cleared field. It did not burn because cleared fields do not burn, not in the way buildings burn. But nobody played baseball on it again, because after January 7th, 1923, there was no one in Rosewood to play. The math of a town erased. 8 homes burned. The church burned. The school burned. The Masonic Lodge burned. The general store burned. Every structure standing in Rosewood, Florida, on January 1st, 1923, was destroyed by January 7th. 6 black residents killed, by the official count of the 1993 state investigation. Sam Carter, Sylvester Carrier, Sarah Carrier, and 3 others whose names appear in different survivor accounts with different degrees of specificity and certainty. Survivors who lived through it estimated the dead at between 27 and 150. The gap between those numbers, between 6 and 150, is the gap that systematic erasure creates, the space where the bodies go when no one is authorized to count them, and no one authorized to investigate looks. 2 white attackers killed in the defense of the Carrier House. 0 arrests, 0 indictments, 0 consequences. 2 years before Rosewood, a white mob destroyed the Greenwood district of Tulsa, Oklahoma, one of the wealthiest black communities in America, called Black Wall Street. Before that, in 1919, the Elaine Massacre in Arkansas, where white men killed between 100 and 240 black sharecroppers who had tried to organize a union. 3 massacres in 5 years, all triggered by either false accusations or minor economic grievances that escalated with the specific, practiced efficiency of something that has been done before and expects to go unpunished, all resulting in the systematic destruction of black communities, all resulting, in the official legal record, in 0 convictions for the perpetrators. The math is not complicated. The math is a policy. Zinnie Dorsey went south through the flatwoods with Cora on her hip, and the January cold was not what Florida cold usually is. It had come down from the north that week, proper cold, the kind that surprises people who live below the freeze line and have made accommodations with warmth, and the swamp water she crossed into was cold enough to take her breath when it reached her waist. She held Cora above the waterline with both arms. She was 5 months pregnant. The metal box with the deed and the title was inside her coat, pressing against her ribs. Behind her, the sky was lit orange. She moved. The Florida scrub swamp in January. Imagine this. January in Florida. The swamp. Water to your knees. Your 3-year-old on your hip. You are pregnant. Behind you, your home is burning. You will not go back. You will not speak of this for 60 years. You are 28 years old. The water is cold. There is mud under it, a mud that grabs and releases with the specificity of something animate, something that wants you to stop moving. In the darkness, the cypress trees are pillars, enormous and dark, their knees rising from the waterline like objects a child might arrange to frighten another child. The Spanish moss hangs in long curtains that move in the cold air, and at night, the swamp makes sounds that the mind in its fear resolves into things it is afraid of. Snakes, men, something worse than either. There is the smell of decay, the constant background smell of a swamp, and over it, from somewhere north, the smell of smoke. The children who were carried through that swamp in January 1923, some of them were very young. Some of them were carried unconscious, sleeping through it, because small children sleep through things adults cannot sleep through, or because they had been given something to keep them quiet and still. Some of them were old enough to be quiet on instruction. None of them were old enough to understand precisely what they were moving away from, which was perhaps a mercy. Cora Dorsey was 3. She held on to her mother's neck and she was quiet. She had understood, from the thing in her mother's face back in the house, that this was the kind of quiet that was required, and she maintained it with the seriousness of a very young child who has been asked to do something important by someone she trusts completely. She would maintain this quiet, in one form or another, for the rest of her life. Other people moved through the swamp that night. Families that survivor accounts name and do not name. A woman who was hurt and needed help moving. A man who had gone back to his house for something and come out with burns on his hands. Children carried, and children walking, and children, in one account, found the next morning in a cedar hammock, alone. The family they had been separated from not accounted for in any subsequent record. The survivors who reached Gainesville and the other towns where the train delivered them came with almost nothing. The clothes they were wearing. Whatever they had been able to grab in the minutes between understanding what was happening and having to move. In Zinnie Dorsey's case, a coat, a child, a metal box with papers proving ownership of a house that no longer stood. By January 7th, 1923, Rosewood, Florida, was gone. Not damaged, not partially destroyed. Gone. There was nothing standing in the area that had been the town. The structures had been burned to the ground, and in some cases below it, as if the people doing the burning wanted to reach a depth that ensured nothing would grow back. The land was there. The land could not be removed. The flatwoods remained. The cedar swamp remained. The roads remained. But the town that had stood on that land was ash. The people who had made it a town were scattered across Florida. Some were in Gainesville. Some were in Jacksonville. Some were with relatives in other counties, other cities, wherever family reached. Some had simply gone in a direction and kept walking, and where they ended up was wherever they stopped. A community of 120 people had been dispersed in 7 days, and the dispersal was so complete and so immediate that no effort to reassemble the community ever occurred, because there was nothing to reassemble around. No church, no school, no store, no lodge, nothing. There were also people unaccounted for, people whose names appear in pre-massacre records and do not appear in any post-massacre record. People who had been in Rosewood on January 1st and were not found anywhere afterward. The official record counted 6 dead. The people who had lived in Rosewood and survived it counted more because they had been there, because they had seen things and heard things that the county never asked them to report, because the county was not asking. Knox Hadley went home. He walked back to Sumner on the morning of January 7th with the smell of smoke in his clothes, and he sat at his kitchen table and his wife made him breakfast, and he ate it. He was 27 years old. He had not started any of this, and he had not stopped any of it, and he had, over the course of 7 nights, crossed a line that had been standing there waiting for him his whole life. And he had crossed it because the crowd was crossing it, and because crossing it had been presented as the correct and obvious thing that men like him were supposed to do in this situation. He never talked about it. Not to his wife, not to his children, not to anyone. The silence that fell on the survivors of Rosewood, the silence they chose or were forced into, the silence of grief and trauma and fear, also fell on the perpetrators, though the silence that fell on Knox Hadley was the silence of a man who has no pressing incentive to speak, since speaking would cost him something, and silence would cost him nothing. He lived to be 74. He died in his bed, in a house he owned, in a town that still existed, which is more than can be said for anyone he burned out of Rosewood. Funny how that works. No arrests were made. On February 10, 1923, a grand jury was convened in Levy County to investigate the events at Rosewood. The grand jury heard testimony. It considered the evidence before it. On February 13th, it found insufficient evidence and disbanded without issuing any indictments. The grand jury had been composed of residents of Levy County, Florida. The men who had burned Rosewood also lived in Levy County, Florida. No survivors of Rosewood were called to testify before the grand jury. No black witnesses were heard. The investigation of a massacre in which the victims were black and the perpetrators were white was conducted without asking the survivors of the massacre what they had seen, because this was Levy County, Florida, in 1923, and the law was not required to pretend otherwise. The grand jury dissolved. The county went back to its regular operations. The Cummer and Sons lumber mill opened for the new year. Fannie Taylor's story was accepted as the account on which the events of January had turned, and nothing further was inquired into. Jesse Hunter, the escaped convict who had been the original justification for the mob, was never conclusively linked to any assault on Fannie Taylor. He was eventually recaptured, in a different part of the state, weeks later. No investigation of his supposed crime was reopened. The connection between Jesse Hunter and the events in Rosewood was never officially examined. Fannie Taylor lived the rest of her life in Florida. She never changed her story. She was never charged with anything. She died decades later, her account intact, part of the record she had made of herself. Rosewood began to disappear, not slowly, not in the way that places usually disappear, through neglect, through population decline, through the slow economic contraction that empties towns over decades and leaves them with boarded windows and grown-over streets, and the sense of a thing that simply ran out of reason to continue. Rosewood disappeared fast, because it was made to disappear fast, because the people who had destroyed it had an interest in the destruction being complete. The name was removed from county maps. Not immediately. This was done in stages, the way official erasure is usually done, through the gradual omission that looks like clerical oversight and functions as policy. The post office designation was eliminated. The roads were not renamed, but they were no longer labeled as leading to or from Rosewood, because there was no longer a Rosewood to lead to. The county records for the settlement, property records, birth and death records, the thin official acknowledgement that a community existed at a particular set of coordinates, were not systematically destroyed, but they were also not maintained or referenced, and in the absence of any living community to claim them, they accumulated dust in county offices that had no incentive to dust them off. Within a decade, a person driving through Levy County on the road between Cedar Key and Gainesville would pass through the place where Rosewood had stood and see nothing. The flatwoods, the cedar swamp, the particular quality, the actual quality, stated once because it needs to be stated, of a Florida scrub landscape in which evidence of human habitation has been removed. The flatness and silence of a place that was cleared by violence and then left alone, which eventually grows over with the same vegetation that was there before, as if the town never happened, as if the ground absorbed it. The cedar grew back. The Spanish moss came back and hung from the trees in long curtains and moved in the Gulf breeze the way it always had. The mockingbirds were there because mockingbirds are always there. And where the AME church had stood, and where the school had stood, and where the Wright store had stood, and where Haywood and Zinnie Dorsey's house had stood, with its deed in a metal box and its porch that faced east toward the Flatwoods, there was nothing. Nothing. The survivors of Rosewood scattered into what silence felt like from the inside. Silence is not the absence of noise. It is a practice. It is something you do, actively, every day, by deciding not to say the thing you know, by training yourself to not reach for the memory when someone asks about your past, by learning to give a different answer to the question of where you are from. The survivors of Rosewood were mostly dispersed through Florida, Jacksonville and Tampa and Gainesville and smaller cities, and they brought with them the thing that survivors of catastrophic violence always bring, which is the knowledge of what happened, and the question of what to do with that knowledge. Most of them chose silence. This needs to be understood from the inside, rather than judged from the outside. The survivors of Rosewood had watched their community be destroyed by a mob of several hundred men, and they had watched the state of Florida respond to this with a grand jury that found insufficient evidence and dissolved in 3 days. And they had watched the county go back to its routine operations without anyone facing any consequence whatsoever, and they were still living in Florida, in cities and towns where the same structures of racial authority that had permitted Rosewood applied, in a country in the 1920s and 1930s and 1940s that was not moving meaningfully toward a moment when their testimony would be heard. Who do you tell when the people who did it run the town, the county, the state? Who do you tell when telling means identifying yourself as a survivor of something the official record says did not happen, in a place that has been erased from the map, to authorities whose predecessors convened a grand jury and found nothing to prosecute? Who do you tell when telling could cost you the job you found, the house you are renting, the precarious safety of the life you have rebuilt in a city where nobody knows what happened to you, where you can be a person who arrived from somewhere rather than a person who survived something? You tell no one. Haywood Dorsey found work in Jacksonville. He found it through a cousin's contact at a lumber operation near the docks, and he worked there for 4 years until his back gave out, and then he found lighter work, maintenance, odd jobs, the kind of employment that a strong man with good hands and no formal education could assemble into a living if he was careful about it. Zinnie found work as a laundress, then as a domestic, then eventually, when Jacksonville's colored schools were taking on teachers, as a classroom teacher again, which she did for 22 years, in a school that was chronically underfunded and overcrowded, and which she ran with the same attention to clean windows and good light that she had brought to the one-room school in Rosewood that was ash. Their daughter Cora grew up in Jacksonville. She grew up knowing that her parents were from somewhere they did not discuss, and that asking about it produced a stillness in both of them that was not like ordinary parental unwillingness to answer a question. It was something denser, something that had weight behind it, and she learned early not to push at it. She knew she had been born in a small town, and that they had left when she was very young. She knew her parents had once owned a house. She knew there was a metal box that her mother kept at the back of a closet shelf, and that the box held papers that her mother called important. She did not know what the papers proved ownership of, because the thing they proved ownership of did not exist anymore. The deed in the metal box was a deed to nothing, to a parcel of land in Levy County, Florida, where nothing stood, where nothing would be built, where no one would ever recognize her parents' claim. Zinni kept it anyway. She kept it because she had gone back through a swamp in January to get it, and she was not going to let that effort mean nothing. She kept it because someday might come, and she intended to be ready for it. Someday didn't come in her lifetime. The second child, the one Zinni had been carrying through the swamp, was born in Gainesville in March 1923, 2 months after the burning. A boy. They named him James. He grew up in Jacksonville not knowing that his first landscape had been a Florida swamp in the dark, that the first motion his body had known outside the womb was his mother walking through cold water, holding him inside her, moving away from the sound of fire. He grew up not knowing, because no one told him. The silence outlasted the people who kept it and passed into the next generation as a gap, as an absence, as the specific kind of family mystery that children sense without being able to name. This is what 60 years of silence looks like from a particular angle. From another angle, in Gainesville, a woman who had been 12 years old during the burning spent the next 60 years waking up at the same hour she had woken up on the train the night of January 5th, at the hour the train had moved away from Rosewood, which was approximately 4 in the morning. She woke every day at 4 and lay in the dark until dawn came, and then she got up and went about her life. She never told her children why she woke at 4. She was not certain, after many years, that she herself still knew exactly why. The body remembered what the mind had learned to organize around, rather than through. In Tampa, a man who had watched the burning from the swamp, who had been too young to help, and stood in the dark water feeling the helplessness of someone present for something he couldn't stop. This man worked as a janitor in a Tampa school for 30 years, and at no point, at any of the funerals of men he had known from Rosewood, said anything about Rosewood, because nobody there knew about it, and there was nothing left to say. The silence was, in a certain register, an act of mercy toward the self. You cannot grieve a thing you are constantly reopening. You cannot function in a life that is organized around the knowledge of a catastrophe that officially did not happen. You learn to put it in a room in your mind, and close the door, and keep the door closed, and over time the door becomes part of the wall, and over time the wall becomes part of the house, and you live in the house without thinking about what is behind that particular wall. This is what survival does. This is not weakness. This is what survival does. Knox Hadley died in 1970. He was 74 years old. He died in his house, in a town that had a name and an address and a place on the map of Florida, and at his funeral his grandchildren stood in their good clothes and listened to the minister speak. The room contained only the story of his life that he had chosen to keep. A man who had worked in a sawmill and raised a family and grown old. Which left out the January week in Rosewood, which would continue to leave it out, because who was there to add it back in? The people who could have added it back in were 50 miles away, in other cities, in other lives, keeping their silence. Zinni retired in 1960. She died in 1978, which was 4 years before Gary Moore began his investigation, which means she died before the silence ended, which means she did not hear the thing said that she had spent 60 years not saying. Haywood died in 1969. He had lived 9 more years than Zinni would live, which was not the order he had expected. He had expected her to outlast him, because she was the one who moved forward, who woke up fast, and moved faster, and he was the one who stood on porches in the morning, listening to the Flatwoods wake up. He spent his last years in a ground-floor apartment in Jacksonville, and in those years he sometimes sat in a chair by the window and looked at the street outside, and looked at it with the attention of someone who is looking at something else. What he was looking at was not on the street. It was in Levy County, on a porch, in the cedar smell and the bad light of a December morning in 1922. He looked at it without speaking. When he died, his daughter Cora found the metal box on the closet shelf where Zinni had kept it, The papers inside were in the order Zinni had arranged them, with the deed on top. The deed was for a half-acre in Rosewood, Florida, in the name of Haywood Dorsey. Cora sat on her parents' bed, with the deed in her hands, and read it twice, and then she put it back in the box, and she put the box on her own closet shelf, and she went home to her own apartment, and she did not speak of it to anyone for 14 years. 1982. A journalist named Gary Moore began hearing rumors. The rumors came through networks of people in Florida who had heard things from elderly relatives, the kind of stories that circulate in the specific half-light of family memory. Not fully told, not fully suppressed, present as a pressure rather than a narrative. Gary Moore was a journalist who paid attention to things that existed as pressure rather than narrative, because he understood that this was often where the actual story lived. He followed the rumors to the survivors. They were old by then. Very old. They had been children or teenagers or young adults during the burning, and 60 years had worked on them the way 60 years works on a body, and they had spent those 60 years in the particular enclosed space of people who carry a thing they have chosen not to put down. Some of them were cautious when Moore found them. Some of them had been waiting. Some of them did not know, until someone asked them to speak, how much they had been waiting to speak. He reported the story. He published it. He got it into print, into the public record, into the category of things that officially existed in Florida and in the United States. And the story of Rosewood, crossed from the underground register where it had been living for 60 years into the daylight register. And people read it. And people who had not known that this happened now knew. The survivors were still alive. Not all of them. Many had died, keeping the silence. Died having never been asked. Died with the knowledge still in the room inside the wall. But some of them were alive. They were in their 70s, their 80s, and they had the specific alertness of very old people who have been carrying something for a long time and have been told, at last, that they may put it down. Delphine Goins was 43 years old in 1982, which meant she was young enough to have energy and old enough to understand what was at stake. She was the granddaughter of a Rosewood survivor, a woman who had never spoken directly about the burning, but who had lived in Jacksonville for 60 years, with the particular orientation of a woman facing away from something, and whose granddaughter had grown up feeling the direction she was facing away from without being able to name it. Delphine had always known, the way children know things they are not told, that there was something behind the wall. Gary Moore's reporting gave it a name. Delphine began to collect testimony. This is not a small thing. Collecting the testimony of elderly survivors of trauma who have been silent for decades requires patience and care, and the willingness to sit for a long time with someone before they trust you enough to open a door they have kept shut for 60 years. Delphine had the patience, not because she was constitutionally patient. She was in fact a fast-moving person who preferred directness, but because she understood that the testimony she was collecting was the only thing standing between those people's experiences and complete disappearance. She drove to Jacksonville and Tampa and Gainesville and smaller places. She sat in living rooms and on porches and in hospital rooms. She brought a tape recorder, which she explained carefully before turning on. She asked questions, and then she did not interrupt the answers, because the answers were long and non-linear and needed time to find their shape. 60 years of silence builds up in a story, the way sediment builds up, and what you get when you break through it is layered and thick and full of things in unexpected order. The stories she collected were specific. The smell of smoke, the sound of the piano 5 days before, the weight of a child on a hip moving through black water, the sound of a rooster, wrong about dawn, which was the last ordinary sound before the extraordinary sounds began, the way a house looks when it is burning, from a distance, from the dark, when it is your house, the 60 years after. She spent 11 years collecting these stories, from 1982 to 1993. And in 1993, the work she had done became the basis for the testimonies that the Florida legislature heard when it convened its formal investigation. The Florida legislature's investigation of the Rosewood Massacre began in 1993, 70 years after the events it was investigating. This is itself a number that requires consideration. 70 years. A person who was 10 years old during the burning was 80 years old when the state of Florida got around to asking them what had happened. A person who was 20 was 90. Many of the survivors had died in the interval. The 9 survivors who were still living and who could testify were old, some of them very old, and some of them were in uncertain health, and some of them had to be helped into the hearing room. They testified. Arnett Goins had been a child in Rosewood. He was in his 80s when he testified before the Florida legislature, a small, precise man in a good suit who had the quality of someone who has decided to be entirely present for a thing he would have been justified in wanting to be absent from. He spoke about what he had seen. He spoke about the years after. He spoke in a voice that was steady with the steadiness of someone who has been carrying a thing for 70 years, and has found that carrying it has made them, if not stronger, then certainly more practiced at maintaining composure. Minnie Lee Langley had been a young woman in Rosewood. She was elderly when she testified, and her voice, according to those who were present in the hearing room, was not loud, but it carried the room completely. She said words that the audience heard and that the official record recorded, and that did not need embellishment or context. She said that she remembered the smell. She said she remembered her mother's hand. She said she had not told anybody for 60 years, because who was she going to tell? Who do you tell when the people who did it run the town, the county, the state? Who do you tell in 1933, in 1943, in 1953, in 1963, when the legal and social architecture of Florida has not changed in ways that would make your testimony meaningful, when the grand jury has already found insufficient evidence and disbanded, when the men who burned your town are still your neighbors in a region where you no longer live, and yet where the structures that permitted the burning remain intact? Who do you tell in 1973, when the men are old now, but the silence is older and harder and more settled? Who do you tell in 1982, when a journalist finds you and turns on a tape recorder and you are 70 years old, and the silence has been your life? You tell it then. When there is finally someone to tell it to, who will write it down? Who will carry it forward? You tell it then. Minnie Lee Langley told it then. Arnett Goins told it then. The others told it. The investigators confirmed the massacre. The report they produced documented what the survivors had described, corroborated it with historical records, newspaper accounts from 1923, the documentary fragments that had survived, and concluded, it happened. Rosewood happened. A mob of white men, estimated at 200 to 300, had destroyed the town of Rosewood over the course of a week in January 1923, killing at least 6 black residents, possibly many more, burning every structure, dispersing the entire community, and facing 0 legal consequences. This was news to the official record. This was not news to the survivors. In 1994, the Florida legislature passed the Rosewood Compensation Act. It was the first time in American history that a state government had compensated the survivors of a racial massacre. Let that settle for a moment. Not the first time a state had investigated a massacre. Not the first time a state had acknowledged that a massacre had occurred. The first time a state had compensated survivors, with money, as recognition that what had been done to them was real and wrong, and had caused losses that the state was responsible for addressing. The first time, in the entire history of the United States, that a state government had translated the acknowledgement of a racial massacre into a financial commitment to the people who had survived it. 9 survivors remained. 9 people out of a community of 120 after 70 years, were alive to receive compensation. They received $150,000 each. The act also established a scholarship fund for descendants of Rosewood families. $150,000 for the house that burned, for the deed in the metal box, for the school with the clean windows, for the church with the good singing, for the piano and the baseball diamond and the Masonic lodge, for the cedar smell and the bad rooster and the December morning on the porch, for 60 years of silence, for the children raised in Jacksonville who were not told where their parents were from, for the waking at 4 in the morning, for the woman who did not leave her porch, $150,000. The survivors accepted it. They were old. Some would not live many more years. They had spent their lives in the Florida economy that had also employed the men who burned their town, and they retired on what they had been able to save, and $150,000 was real money, and they took it. Arnett Goins took it. Minnie Lee Langley took it. The 7 others took it. Cora Dorsey, Haywood and Zinnie's daughter, the 3-year-old who had been carried through the swamp, was not among the 9. She had died in 1991, 3 years before the Compensation Act. She died before the legislature's investigation, before the testimony, before the money. She died with the metal box on her closet shelf in her apartment in Jacksonville, and when her children sorted through her things, they found the box and found the deed inside and brought it to the lawyer handling her estate. And the lawyer looked at the deed and looked at the address and said he would look into it, and the looking into it eventually reached the state investigation, and the Dorsey family is among the families of Rosewood descendants who received scholarships under the 1994 Act. The deed is in a museum now, part of a collection of Rosewood materials in Florida. The deed to a half-acre in Rosewood, Florida, in the name of Haywood Dorsey, executed in 1919, 4 years before everything it described was destroyed. Delphine Goins was 54 years old in 1994. She sat in the gallery of the Florida legislature on the day the Rosewood Compensation Act passed, and she did not cry, because she was not a person who cried in public, and she had the quality of someone who has spent 11 years working toward a thing, and who, now that the thing has happened, is already thinking about the next thing that needs to happen. The next thing was the scholarship fund. The next thing was the memorial. The next thing was the history curriculum. The next thing was the 17 other states where this had happened, and where it was still not acknowledged, and still not compensated, and still just gone, the way Rosewood had been gone, from the map and the record and the official memory. The work was not done. The work is not done. But on that day, in that room, the state of Florida said, "It happened. We know it happened. We are responsible for allowing it to happen and for failing to address it for 70 years. The survivors are owed something. It was not enough. It was something." There is a historical marker now on a road through pine flatwoods in Levy County, Florida. A green sign on a metal post at the side of the road that runs through the place where Rosewood stood. The sign says what happened, in the compressed and formal language of historical markers, which tries to convey 7 days of catastrophe and 70 years of silence in 200 words, and which does not fully succeed, because 200 words are not enough, because nothing is quite enough. But the marker is there. What does it mean to mark a place that was deliberately erased? It means that the erasure is no longer complete, that the effort put into removing this place from the record, which was substantial and systematic, and in many ways successful for 60 years, did not ultimately hold. It means that the land at the coordinates knows its own name now. It means that a person driving through Levy County on the road between Cedar Key and Gainesville can stop and read a sign and know that they are standing on ground where something happened, and that the something is in the record, is in the public acknowledgement, is not behind a wall in a room that only the survivors can find. Florida was the first state to compensate massacre survivors. It remains one of the very few. In most of the states where similar events occurred, where black communities were destroyed by white mobs, where the survivors scattered and the records were erased or never made, where the grand juries found insufficient evidence and disbanded and the years passed, no comparable acknowledgement and no comparable compensation has followed. The Tulsa Massacre of 1921, which destroyed Greenwood, which destroyed what had been called Black Wall Street, is more widely known now than it was for much of the 20th century. Descendants of Greenwood survivors have testified before state and federal bodies. No compensation has been paid. The pattern that connected Rosewood to Tulsa, to Elaine, to 100 other events across 100 other counties and states, is a pattern that the country has been very slow to look at directly, and slower still to look at with the intention of doing something about what it sees. The historical marker means something. It means less than it should. But the cedars grew back. This is true. In the flat woods around the place where Rosewood stood, the Florida red cedar that made the town's first economy came back, slowly, the way trees come back in land that has been cleared and abandoned. Not the great stands that the pencil mills stripped out in the cedar boom, but a regrowth, a return, the land reasserting something. The mockingbirds are there. The Spanish moss is there. The smell, on a warm day, standing near the flatwoods at the right time of year, in the right light, the cedar smell is there. The town is not. Return now to the December morning. The cedar smell comes first, before dawn in Rosewood, Florida, rising off the flatwoods and the swamp hammock. A smell so deep and so constant that the people who live here have long since stopped noticing it. But you notice it now, because you know it now, because you have been here long enough to know what it means and what it costs. Haywood Dorsey is on the porch with his coffee. The whippoorwills are finishing. The mockingbirds are starting. Gussie Mitchum's rooster is announcing itself with the particular lunatic urgency of a bird that has never been right about dawn, and Haywood smiles into his coffee without meaning to. Inside, Zinnie is still asleep. In 20 minutes, she will make a sound like a question. She will be fully awake and moving. She will teach her 11 students today in a room with clean windows. She is 5 months pregnant. She is 28 years old. Their daughter Cora is in the back room under a quilt, asleep. At the end of the road, Gussie Mitchum will sit on her porch this evening and watch the road with the attention of someone who has lived long enough to know that the road is where everything comes from. George Bradley will play piano tonight at the juke joint, and Aaron Carrier will stand near the wall and listen, and the corn liquor will taste like corn liquor always tastes, and the sound of it will carry across the flatwoods in the cold air. Sylvester Carrier will clean his shotgun in the morning the way he always cleans it. Sarah Carrier will go to work in Sumner and come home. John Wright will open his store and know everybody's name. Sam Carter will track deer through the cedar hammock with the knowledge of a man who has spent his life learning to read a landscape. The AME church is there. The school is there. The lodge is there. The baseball diamond is there. The cedar smell is everywhere, in every plank and post and piece of furniture, in the clothes on the line, and the soil in the garden, and the hair of every person who has lived here for any length of time. This is Rosewood. 4 weeks from now, none of this will exist. But right now, the porch, the coffee going cold, the bad rooster, wrong again about dawn, the flatwoods waking up in stages, bird by bird, in the thin gold Florida winter light. This is December 1922. This is Rosewood, Florida. GPS coordinates point to a road through pine flatwoods. There is a historical marker now. The cedars grew back. The town did not.